While we continue to watch these pictures, and again, these are coming to you live from Stewart Airport, about 50 miles, maybe 60 miles north of Manhattan. I've actually landed my little plane there, but I don't think you're going to see a whole lot of general aviation traffic in there right now. There's probably a security lockdown on top of Stewart Airport at this moment. Anyway, while we continue to watch the activities of this particular Boeing aircraft, let's bring in retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. He's a senior fellow and military expert for defense priorities. So, Lieutenant Colonel Davis, tell us about what you think the United States accomplished in Venezuela overnight.
Well, I'll tell you, I caution a little bit of, I guess, just kind of taking a deep breath, because obviously the military operation itself, in terms of just the skill of the troops and the planning at the operational level, the tactical level, was just unmatched. I mean, the fact that we could get in with 150 aircraft and to take out air defense systems and to turn off the electricity to get the president of a country in and out without the loss of any life or any aircraft is just almost unheard of. It's just amazing. But all of the hard stuff still remains, because President Trump was emphatic today during that press conference that he plans on running Venezuela, and he's going to put some of his people. He said Secretary Hegseth, Secretary Rubio, we're going to be in charge of a group that's going to decide who's going to be ruling that country. Will the people on the ground accept that? Because he said if they don't, he said there could be another round. So there could be more violence to follow. Whatever gets put on the ground here, will though the people on the ground, all of the power structures that were loyal to Maduro are still in place. So if you want to insert somebody else, will they get the working together with those people, or will you get some kind of insurgency like we saw after the Iraq War in 2003? Many things of that nature. It's going to continue to be decided. And so we don't know where this is going to go yet. And I'm just telling you, historically, when we do regime change operations, it rarely goes smoothly. And I don't know if this one's going to go that way or not. It's just too early to tell.
Well, yes, and it's certainly hard to know how deep the loyalty to Maduro is among those he left behind. Sometimes a strong man, a thug, puts people in place who are there who will do his bidding, but don't necessarily agree with what he's doing.
Well, for sure, that's exactly right, and that's the loyalty only goes as far as they benefit from it. But what we've seen in similar situations, I mean, you can go to Iraq, you can go to Libya in 2011. I mean, it can be really ugly, because when people have power, they don't want to give it up. Moreover, depending on who might come in there, somebody might want to replace them, and somebody who's had power and has access is not going to want to give that up without a fight. So that's why I say there are still so many unknowns about how this could go. And so before we get too excited about the good tactical operation we had today, we need to be sober-minded that there's still a lot of hard work to do and a lot of things that could go sideways.
I have to think that it's awfully strange to be Nicolás Maduro right now. You went to bed last night as the leader of a nation, obviously surrounded in opulence and luxury. All of a sudden, there are loud explosions and probably Delta Force rifles in your face, and you get arrested and put on board an aircraft and spirited out of the country. Tonight, he's going to be sleeping probably in a 6-by-8-foot gray box. But I guess he can be thankful that he's not going to see an end like Muammar Gaddafi saw, Lieutenant Colonel Davis.
Well, and you have to. That's one of the other evidences that I think that probably there were almost certainly some insider help here, because the fact that Maduro knew that we were coming, that he may not know in the hour, but he certainly knew that it was going to happen, because he's been talking to Trump personally. He's been trying to have negotiations. He sees, of course, all these rehearsals, these jets that have been flying around in his airspace. So the fact that even when he's ready and understanding was not already in a safe location, didn't get there in time when helicopters are landing, after bombs start falling, that just shows that he's, I think, just did not take the normal precautions to get in, or there was some insider information that helped him to not be captured and to not be killed in a firefight like what happened with Osama bin Laden, for example.
Well, and I think a lot of these strong men think that they really are that strong, and that, somebody like President Trump would never dare to try to depose a thug like Nicolás Maduro.
It could well be. I don't know at this point that that's a very smart thing to think. But you see that Maduro was literally dancing around out in the open, not taking any precautions in the days ahead of this. So that alone told me that it wasn't going to be that hard if we decided to go in to find out where he was, as opposed to, like some of these other leaders, like of Hezbollah, for example. Israel finally got the leader of Nasrallah, but only after a long search because he was very careful to not come out in the open, etc. Maduro was not even trying to hide himself, so it wasn't very smart on his part. I don't know if he just thought Trump wasn't going to come in, or he's just not that smart. But it turned out to be a pretty bad decision.
Lieutenant Colonel Davis, stay with us for just a moment. I just want to reset for our viewers where we are. Our friends at WNYW and their helicopter is flying above Stewart Airport. This is a public airport 60, maybe 70 miles north and west of New York City. A Boeing 757 has just landed there. It is owned and operated by the U.S. Department of Justice. You can see a number of people with what appear to be weapons standing around the base of that aircraft, and where the door is open, a number of people from the DEA, or at least wearing DEA and FBI jackets, ran into the plane. Is this the plane with Nicolás Maduro on board? We don't absolutely have that confirmed yet, but I think you can gather from what is taking place. Well, you jump to your own conclusions, I guess. I'll just say that. At any rate, as darkness continues to fall there, we hope we're going to see exactly who emerges from this aircraft in a little bit. It's obviously getting darker, and they're opening the iris as much as they can in their camera to try to give some light to the situation. We'll keep watching it live as we talk to retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. All right, so you said, what comes next is the difficult part, but the president has warned, if there are ne'er-do-wells who want to continue to run the thugocracy in Venezuela, they're going to face another potential strike from American military forces if they don't get in line. Has enough been done, Lieutenant Colonel Davis, do you think, to sort of enforce discipline among any would-be Maduros down there? That part we just don't know, because there could be certainly some mentality on some of those that may take power. And right now, apparently, the vice president has not taken power, but still says Maduro is the president and she is the vice president, though apparently she's actually in charge. But will they submit to any further? President Trump said that he talked to Marco Rubio, talked to her and said that she's willing to cooperate. We haven't heard that from her yet, so we'll see if that comes to pass. But, one of the other sticking points and one of the other points of potential problem here is that Trump also said one of our objectives is now to take the Venezuelan oil and to go in and to upgrade that situation. He said it could literally take years. And will the Venezuelan people be okay with that? I mean, we're talking about some of the leaders and the thugs, et cetera. But then the question is, what about the people of Venezuela? Are they going to be okay with their oil being controlled by a foreign entity? And I don't think that's going to be an easy opportunity. Yes, President Trump said that it would help the people, but he also said we would take it and we would take the financial resources. So that's another big problem. There's a lot of legal issues that are involved with that too. But there's also the simple matter of, will the Venezuelan people cooperate, or will they start some kind of an insurgency? Well, we just had a number of other people wearing DEA jackets head up the stairs and into that aircraft. It's, again, not absolutely clear that Nicolás Maduro and his wife are on board, but you can draw your own conclusions. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, you were talking about the oil and the fact that the president says, we will be selling the oil or paying for some of our intervention operations by way of the oil. A lot of people forget that the Venezuelan government basically stole oil equipment, stole oil operations from Chevron and other American oil companies. In fact, it was considered at the time one of the, if not the biggest thefts in world history. So, if our president says, yeah, we're going to take some Venezuelan oil and pay for the help we're giving them, maybe the Venezuelan people wouldn't necessarily appreciate it, but I think a lot of Americans might.
Well, I mean, we just got to be honest. That's a lot of interpretation about which side of the line you're on there, because the Venezuelans nationalized that, and there was a lot of disputes about what happened in terms of the compensation that was done. It's not like it was physically stolen. Certainly, the companies didn't feel like they got a fair deal. But the question is, though, legally, if you think there was a raw deal, there are legal avenues. But to go in and invade a country and to depose the leader, that's not a really good precedent to set here, because then others may do the same thing, and maybe in countries we don't want them to do it in. So there could be ramifications of this we may not like.
Yeah, well, I don't think the president deposed Maduro necessarily entirely because of the oil situation. I think it had more to do with the narco trafficking that he's accused of and has been legally indicted for since 2020. But I am saying that, you were talking about the oil revenues and who gets them. I'm saying that the American companies who had their oil facilities essentially stolen from them, they do have a legal case, it would seem.
I agree. If there is a legal case to be made, then they certainly should make that. My position is, though, that using armed force of the United States, especially decades later, I don't know that there's a lot of legal foundation for that, because that's a legal issue. And so we're interpreting it and then taking action upon it. And then you talk about the issue of the narcotics. I mean, even by the Trump's own administration, especially in their first Trump administration, where they listed Venezuela pretty small in terms of the narco stuff that coming into America. Most stuff from Venezuela went to Europe, not the United States. So this has not really protected us that much. It's Colombia, it's Mexico, it's China, it's India, where most of the stuff coming into America are.
Retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, thanks for your expertise.
Click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You won't get it anywhere else.